She was standing on a crate in the rain, and no one dared to say she was only 15. The rain came down in sheets across Dusty Creek, turning the main street into a river of mud and horse manure. Most folks had the good sense to stay indoors, huddled around their fires, waiting for the storm to pass. But there she was, standing on an overturned apple crate in front of Mackerson's general store, her dark hair plastered to her skull, her simple cotton dress clinging to her small frame like a second skin. Sarah Jane McCready had been standing there for the better part of an hour, and not a soul in town had the courage to tell her to go home. Maybe it was the way she held herself, chin up, shoulders squared, feet planted firm, despite the wooden crate shifting in the mud beneath her. Maybe it was the fire in her green eyes that seemed to burn brighter than the lightning crackling overhead. Or maybe it was simply that everyone in Dusty Creek knew what she'd lost and why she was standing there in the pouring rain like some avenging angel waiting for the devil himself to show his face. Inside the saloon across the street, men peered through the rain-streaked windows and shook their heads. "Someone ought to fetch her pa," muttered old Pete Lawson, nursing his whiskey like it might wash away the guilt he'd been carrying for weeks. "Her pa's been in the ground 3 days now," replied Tom Sullivan, the blacksmith, his voice heavy with something between sorrow and shame. "Ain't nobody left to fetch." The batwing doors of the saloon swung open, and Sheriff Bill Watson stepped out onto the covered boardwalk. Rain drummed against the wooden overhang above his head as he studied the girl in the street. Watson was a good man as lawmen went, but he was also practical. He knew when to pick his battles, and he knew when he was looking at one he couldn't win. "Sarah Jane," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm, "you best come in out of this weather. You'll catch your death standing out there." The girl turned her head slightly, just enough to fix him with those burning green eyes. When she spoke, her voice cut through the rain like a blade through silk. "My death?" she said, and there was something in her tone that made even the sheriff take a step back. "I reckon my death ain't the one we should be worrying about, Sheriff Watson." The sheriff opened his mouth to say something else, then thought better of it. He'd known Sarah Jane since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, had watched her grow from a wild-haired little thing into the determined young woman standing before him now. He'd also known her father, Samuel McCready, and he knew exactly why she was standing in that street. Samuel McCready had been the best horse trainer in 3 counties, a man who could gentle the wildest mustang with nothing but patience and kindness. He'd also been the only man in Dusty Creek brave enough to stand up to Clayton Briggs and his gang of cutthroats when they'd started terrorizing the local ranchers. 3 weeks ago, Briggs and his men had ridden into town demanding protection money from every business owner on Main Street. Most had paid, too frightened of Briggs's reputation to refuse, but not Samuel McCready. When Briggs had cornered him outside the bank demanding $50 or consequences, Samuel had looked the outlaw dead in the eye and told him exactly where he could put his protection money. 2 days later, Samuel McCready was found shot dead on the trail to his ranch. Everyone in town knew who'd pulled the trigger, but nobody was willing to say it out loud. Clayton Briggs was wanted in 4 states, and his gang was known for leaving nothing but blood and ashes in their wake. The good people of Dusty Creek had decided that sometimes it was better to look the other way. Everyone except Sarah Jane McCready. She'd buried her father with her own hands, digging the grave in the little cemetery behind the church, while the preacher mumbled prayers and the townspeople shuffled their feet and avoided her eyes. She'd stood over that grave for an hour after the last mourner had gone home, her fists clenched at her sides, making promises to a dead man that would have made a grown man's blood run cold. Now she was standing in the rain, waiting. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Sarah Jane showed no signs of moving. Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating her face in stark detail, the sharp cheekbones she'd inherited from her Cherokee grandmother, the determined set of her jaw that was pure McCready stubbornness, and those eyes that seemed to hold all the fury of the gathering storm. Inside the general store behind her, Martha Mackerson wrung her hands and paced back and forth behind the counter. "John," she whispered to her husband, "we can't just let her stand out there. She's just a child." John Mackerson looked up from the ledger he'd been pretending to read and shook his head. "That girl ain't been a child since the day her mama died birthing her," he said quietly, "and she sure ain't been one since she put her pa in the ground. But she's only 15. Age don't mean nothing when you got that kind of fire in your belly," John interrupted. "Besides, what would you have me do? Drag her inside? You seen what happened to the last man who tried to tell a McCready what to do?" Martha fell silent, remembering. 2 years ago, a drifter had made the mistake of putting his hands on Sarah Jane outside the church social. Samuel McCready had broken 3 of the man's ribs and his nose before Sheriff Watson could pull him off. The drifter had left town that same night and hadn't been seen since. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats began to echo through the storm. At first it was just a distant rumble, easily mistaken for thunder. But as the sound grew closer, it took on the steady rhythm of horses moving at a determined pace. Sarah Jane heard it too. She straightened on her crate, her hand moving instinctively to the gun belt strapped around her waist. Her father's Colt .45, worn smooth by years of use and loaded with 6 bullets that she'd learned to fire with deadly accuracy. The riders appeared at the far end of Main Street, like ghosts materializing from the storm. 6 men on horseback, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats, their slickers glistening with rain. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the easy confidence with which they sat their horses, the casual way their hands rested near their weapons. Clayton Briggs rode at the front of the group, a tall, lean man with cruel eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull knife. He was wanted for murder, robbery, and worse in 4 states, but he moved through the world like a man who owned it. The riders slowed as they entered the town proper, their horses' hooves splashing through the muddy street. Briggs's eyes swept the empty boardwalks and shuttered windows, taking note of the way the townspeople had made themselves scarce. His gaze finally settled on the lone figure standing in the rain, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for his voice to carry over the storm. "If it ain't little Sarah Jane McCready, all grown up and playing dress-up with her daddy's gun." Sarah Jane said nothing, but her hand tightened on the grip of her father's Colt. Briggs dismounted, his boots squelching in the mud as he stepped toward her. His men remained on their horses, their hands resting on their guns, ready for trouble. The outlaw was tall, well over 6 feet, and Sarah Jane had to crane her neck to look up at him from her makeshift platform. "You know," Briggs continued, his voice conversational, almost friendly, "your daddy was a stubborn man, real stubborn, got him killed in the end." "My daddy was a good man," Sarah Jane replied, her voice steady despite the rain streaming down her face, "which is more than can be said for the yellow-bellied snake that shot him in the back." Briggs's smile widened, but his eyes went cold. "Careful, little girl, you're talking about things you don't understand." "I understand plenty," Sarah Jane shot back. "I understand you killed my pa because he wouldn't bow down to you like the rest of this town. I understand you think you can ride in here and take whatever you want, and I understand that today, that stops." A murmur ran through Briggs's men, and the outlaw's hand moved closer to his gun. "Is that so? And just how do you figure to stop me, little girl? You planning to shoot all 6 of us with that pea shooter?" "Just you," Sarah Jane said simply. "The rest of your boys can ride out of here with their tails between their legs, or they can join you in hell. Makes no difference to me." The street fell silent, except for the steady drumming of rain on wood and the occasional rumble of thunder. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sheriff Watson emerged from the saloon, his hand on his gun, but he made no move to intervene. He knew, as everyone else in town knew, that this moment had been inevitable from the day Samuel McCready died. Some debts could only be paid in blood. "You got spirit, girl," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the storm. "I'll give you that, but spirit don't stop bullets, and it sure don't bring back the dead." "No," Sarah Jane agreed, "but justice does." For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Briggs' hand flashed toward his gun, his fingers closing around the grip with the speed that had kept him alive through a dozen gunfights. But Sarah Jane was faster. The Colt .45 appeared in her hand like magic, the barrel lining up with Briggs's chest before he'd even cleared leather. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the street like a cannon blast, and Clayton Briggs staggered backward, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. He looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest, then back up at the girl standing on the crate. "How?" he began, but the words died in his throat along with everything else. Clayton Briggs, the terror of 4 states, toppled face first into the mud of Main Street and moved no more. For a long moment nobody moved. Briggs's men sat frozen on their horses, staring in shock at their fallen leader. The townspeople pressed their faces to windows and doorways, scarcely believing what they'd witnessed. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly, as if the storm itself was awed by what had just transpired. Then one of Briggs's men, a nervous-looking fellow with a patchy beard, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Well," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I reckon we'll be moving on now." He wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the edge of town. The other 4 followed suit, apparently having no desire to test their luck against the girl who'd just gunned down the fastest draw in the territory. Sarah Jane watched them go, the smoking Colt still in her hand. Only when they'd disappeared into the storm did she finally lower the weapon and step down from her crate. Sheriff Watson approached cautiously, his boots splashing through the muddy street. "Sarah Jane," he said quietly, "you know I'm going to have to ask you some questions about this." She nodded.
holstering her father's gun with practiced ease. "I know, Sheriff, but first I got something to say to this town." She turned to face the buildings lining Main Street, raising her voice so it would carry to every ear pressed against every window and door. "My name is Sarah Jane McCready," she called out, her voice strong and clear despite the rain. "I'm 15 years old, and I just killed the man who murdered my father. I ain't asking for thanks, and I ain't asking for forgiveness, but I am telling you this: the next man who tries to terrorize this town is going to answer to me, same as Clayton Briggs did, and if any of you think my age makes me weak, well," she gestured toward the body in the mud, "I reckon Clayton Briggs thought the same thing." With that, she turned and walked toward the sheriff's office, her head held high, leaving the townspeople to stare after her in amazement and awe. Later that night, after she'd given her statement and been released on her own recognizance, Sarah Jane sat on the porch of her father's house, watching the storm finally begin to clear. The rain had stopped, and stars were beginning to peek through the breaking clouds. She thought about her father, about the promises she'd made at his graveside, and about the man lying dead in the street. She felt no remorse for what she'd done. Clayton Briggs had been a rabid dog that needed putting down, and she'd been the only one with the courage to do it. But she also thought about the years ahead, about the reputation she'd just earned, and about the challenges that would come with it. Word would spread about what had happened in Dusty Creek, and there would be others who would want to test themselves against the girl who'd outdrowned Clayton Briggs. She was ready for them. 3 days before the confrontation, Sarah Jane had known this moment was coming. She'd felt it in her bones the way her Cherokee grandmother had taught her to feel approaching storms. The old woman, her father's mother, had died when Sarah Jane was 12, but not before passing on the ancient wisdom that ran in their bloodline. "Listen to the wind, child," Grandmother Walking Bear had whispered on her deathbed. "It carries messages from the spirit world. Your enemies will announce themselves long before they arrive, if you know how to hear." Sarah Jane had heard the whispers in town, seen the way people's eyes shifted when they thought she wasn't looking. She'd overheard Tom Sullivan talking to the preacher about how someone ought to send word to the territorial marshal, and how Martha Mackerson had suggested that maybe it's time for certain folks to move on, for their own safety. They meant well, these people who'd watched her grow up, but they didn't understand. This wasn't about safety. This was about something deeper, something that went to the very core of who she was and who her family had always been. The McCready name meant something in this part of the territory. Her grandfather, Duncan McCready, had been one of the first settlers to establish a ranch in the valley, carving a homestead out of wilderness with nothing but determination and an old Henry rifle. He'd fought Comanche raiders, survived 3 harsh winters when the cattle died and the crops failed, and built a legacy of stubborn courage that ran through his bloodline like iron through rock. Her father, Samuel, had inherited that same unbreakable spirit. When drought threatened the ranch, he dug wells by hand until his fingers bled. When rustlers tried to steal their cattle, he'd tracked them across 2 counties and brought back every head. And when Clayton Briggs had demanded tribute like some medieval king, Samuel McCready had looked him in the eye and chosen death over dishonor. Now it was Sarah Jane's turn to prove that the McCready blood ran true. She'd spent those 3 days preparing, not just her weapon, but her mind and spirit. Every morning she'd risen before dawn and practiced her draw in the barn, using her father's Colt until the movement became as natural as breathing. The gun had felt foreign in her hands at first, too heavy, too powerful, but gradually it had begun to feel like an extension of herself. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 10, starting with tin cans on fence posts and working up to moving targets. "A gun ain't a toy, Sarah Jane," he'd told her solemnly. "It's a tool, and like any tool, it's only as good as the person wielding it. You treat it with respect and it'll never let you down." But target practice was one thing. Facing down a killer in the middle of Main Street was something else entirely. On the night before the storm, Sarah Jane had sat by her father's grave and told him everything she was planning to do. She'd spoken to the weathered wooden cross as if he could hear her, explaining her reasoning, asking for his blessing, preparing herself for what she knew would change her life forever. "I know you'd tell me to let the law handle it, Pa," she'd whispered to the freshly turned earth, "but we both know Sheriff Watson's a good man who's in over his head. And the territorial marshal's 3 days' ride away if he even bothers to come at all. By the time any official law arrives, Briggs will have bled this town dry and moved on to terrorize someone else." A night breeze had stirred the wildflowers she'd planted on the grave, and for a moment Sarah Jane could have sworn she heard her father's voice carried on the wind. "Do what's right, little bird. Do what's right and let the consequences fall where they may." That had been Samuel McCready's philosophy all his life. Do what's right, regardless of the cost. It was why he'd refused to pay Briggs's protection money. It was why he'd died with his honor intact. And it was why his daughter now carried the burden of avenging him. The morning of the storm, Sarah Jane had felt the change in the air before she'd even opened her eyes. The pressure was dropping, and the wind carried the scent of rain and electricity. She'd dressed carefully that morning, choosing her father's old work shirt and her most practical riding skirt. She'd braided her long dark hair to keep it out of her face, and she'd strapped on her father's gun belt with the solemnity of a knight donning armor. Before leaving the house, she'd written a letter and left it on the kitchen table, addressed to Sheriff Watson. In it she'd explained her actions and her reasoning, and she'd made it clear that she acted alone, without encouragement or assistance from anyone in town. If there were to be consequences, she wanted them to fall on her shoulders alone. Then she'd walked to Main Street, found the sturdiest crate she could locate, and begun her vigil. The waiting had been the hardest part. Standing in the rain for over an hour, feeling the cold seep into her bones, watching the townspeople peer at her through their windows like she was some kind of curiosity, she'd seen the pity in their eyes, the way they looked at her like she was a poor deluded child playing at being an adult. But Sarah Jane knew something they didn't. She knew that childhood ended the moment you were willing to kill or die for something bigger than yourself. She knew that age was just a number when weighed against the strength of your convictions, and she knew that sometimes, when the adults failed to act, it fell to the next generation to set things right. When Briggs and his men had finally appeared through the rain, Sarah Jane had felt a strange calm settle over her. All the fear, all the doubt, all the questions about whether she was doing the right thing, it all fell away, leaving only crystal clear purpose. She'd known she was faster than Briggs the moment she'd seen him draw. Her father had always said that speed came from the mind, not the hand, and that the fastest gun belonged to the person who'd already made peace with pulling the trigger. Clayton Briggs had hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as his brain processed the reality of drawing down on a 15-year-old girl. Sarah Jane had felt no such hesitation. Now, sitting on her father's porch in the aftermath, she understood that her life had been divided into two parts, before and after. Before, she'd been Samuel McCready's daughter, a girl growing up in a frontier town, learning to ride and shoot and tend cattle. After, she was something else entirely, a living legend, a symbol of courage that would inspire some and challenge others. The responsibility of it weighed on her shoulders like a heavy coat, but she wore it willingly. This was her inheritance, passed down through generations of McCready stubbornness and Cherokee wisdom. She was the culmination of all the courage that had come before her, and the foundation for all the courage that would come after. Inside the house, the letter she'd written to Sheriff Watson still sat on the kitchen table, undelivered. She'd decided she didn't need it anymore. Let people draw their own conclusions about what had happened in the street. Let them tell their own stories about the girl who'd faced down Clayton Briggs. The truth would survive, one way or another, and that was all that mattered. As the last of the clouds drifted away and the stars emerged in all their glory, Sarah Jane McCready sat on her father's porch and planned for a future that would be unlike anything she'd ever imagined. She would continue to run the ranch, she would continue to protect the town, and she would continue to honor the McCready name in the only way she knew how, by doing what was right, regardless of the cost. And if that made her a legend, so be it. Legends, after all, were just ordinary people who'd been brave enough to do extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. Sarah Jane McCready had found her moment in the rain and thunder of a summer storm, and she'd proven herself worthy of the blood that ran in her veins. As she sat there in the darkness, Sarah Jane McCready made another promise, not to a dead man this time, but to herself. She would protect this town and its people, not because they deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. She would be the shield between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. She was only 15 years old, but she'd just proven that age was nothing more than a number. In the Old West, respect was earned with lead and steel, and Sarah Jane McCready had just earned more respect than most men twice her age would ever see. The last of the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a sky full of stars and a moon that seemed to smile down on the quiet town of Dusty Creek. And on the porch of the McCready house, a young woman who was no longer a girl sat watching over her domain, one hand resting on the grip of her father's gun, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. In years to come, travelers passing through Dusty Creek would hear the story of the girl who faced down Clayton Briggs in the rain. They'd hear about the 15-year-old who stood on a crate in a thunderstorm and proved that courage had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the strength of one's convictions. And if those travelers were smart, they'd tip their hats respectfully when they saw Sarah Jane McCready walking down Main Street, because they'd know they were in the presence of a legend in the making. But that night, as the storm finally passed and peace settled over the town like a comfortable blanket, she was simply a girl who'd done what needed doing, sitting on her father's porch and planning for a future that would be shaped by the choices she'd made in the rain. The crate still sat in the muddy street, a silent testament to the moment when everything changed, and though the townspeople would eventually move it, they'd never forget what it represented. The place where a girl became a guardian, where justice was served with a smoking gun, and where the legend of Sarah Jane McCready was born in the thunder and lightning of a summer storm. She was standing on a crate in the rain, and no one dared to say she was only 15, because in that moment, age didn't matter, only courage did, and courage she had in abundance.